in the bitter cold of Montana Territory, where winter stretched longer than a man's patience, and the wind cut through leather like it was paper, there lived a cowboy who had forgotten how to feel warmth. Not the kind that comes from fire or whiskey, but the kind that lives in the space between two people when they choose each other against all odds. His name was Garrett Stone, and he was known throughout the territory as the coldest man to ever sit a saddle. Not cold in body, though the Montana winters had tried their best to freeze him solid. Cold in spirit, cold in heart. The kind of cold that comes when a man has been hurt so deep that he builds walls higher than the mountain peaks around him. But this story isn't about the walls he built. It's about the woman who sat down in front of them like she belonged there, like she had all the time in the world to wait for them to crumble. Some say love is like lightning, striking fast and burning bright. Others claim it's like a river, steady and sure, carving its path through stone over time. But in the high country of Montana Territory, where the snow falls 8 months out of 12 and a man's word is the only currency that matters, love sometimes arrives like the first thaw of spring, quiet, patient, unstoppable. This is the story of how the coldest cowboy in the territory learned that some things are worth melting for. How a woman with nothing but determination and a heart full of hope managed to do what no blizzard, no bullet, and no broken promise had ever done. She made Garrett Stone remember what it felt like to be human. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how a heart that frozen could ever learn to beat warm again, you need to know what made it freeze in the first place. 3 years before our story begins, Garrett Stone was a different man. He laughed easier then, smiled quicker, and when he looked at the horizon, he saw a possibility instead of just another day to survive. He had a woman then too, Sarah Mitchell, with hair like spun gold and promises sweet as summer honey. They were planning to marry come spring, to build a life together on the land he'd claimed near Willow Creek. But promises, like everything else in the territory, could be broken by weather. The winter of 1871 was the worst anyone could remember. Snow fell for 6 weeks straight, drifts piling higher than a horse's head, and the cold so bitter it could crack teeth. When the blizzards finally stopped and the people of Bear Creek Township could dig themselves out, they found that Sarah Mitchell had disappeared in the night, not taken by the cold or lost to the storm, but gone by choice. Vanished with a traveling merchant who had promised her warm winters in California and a life easier than what Montana could offer. She left no note, no explanation, just an engagement ring sitting on the kitchen table like an accusation. That's when Garrett Stone's heart froze solid. He stopped talking except when necessary, stopped smiling altogether, stopped looking at the horizon like it held anything worth seeing. He built a cabin on the loneliest stretch of land he could find, miles from the nearest neighbor, and set about the business of living like a ghost. The only warmth he allowed himself was what came from hard work and harder whiskey. Men in town started calling him the Iceman. Said his blood had turned to winter, that he could stare down a grizzly bear without blinking, face a gunfight without sweating. They weren't wrong. Garrett Stone had mastered the art of feeling nothing at all. But here's what those men didn't understand about frozen hearts. They're not broken beyond repair. They're just waiting for the right kind of warmth to bring them back to life. And that warmth came walking into Bear Creek Township on a Tuesday morning in March, wearing a faded blue dress and carrying everything she owned in a carpet bag that had seen better days. Her name was Emma Rose, and she was running from something too, though she carried her pain different than Garrett did. Where he had built walls, she had built bridges. Where he had chosen isolation, she had chosen hope. And when she first laid eyes on the coldest cowboy in the territory, sitting alone at a corner table in Murphy's saloon, she saw something that everyone else had missed. She saw a man worth waiting for. The first time they met, it didn't go well. Garrett was nursing his usual whiskey, sitting with his back to the wall and his hat pulled low, when Emma Rose walked up to his table like she'd been invited. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, already pulling out the chair across from him. Garrett looked up, his gray eyes flat as winter sky. Table's full, he said, though he was clearly sitting alone. Emma Rose smiled, the kind of smile that could melt icicles. Doesn't look full to me. She sat down anyway, folding her hands on the table like she was settling in for a long conversation. Lady, I don't know what you're after, but you won't find it here. His voice was rough as gravel, cold as the wind outside. I'm not after anything, she said simply. Just thought you looked like you could use some company. Garrett Stone had perfected the art of intimidation. One look from those ice-cold eyes had been known to make grown men reconsider their life choices. But Emma Rose just sat there, calm as a pond on a windless day, like his coldness was nothing more than weather to be endured. I don't want company, he said finally. I know, she replied. That's why you need it. They sat in silence after that. Emma Rose patient as stone, Garrett Stone wishing she would leave, but somehow unable to get up and walk away himself. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he pushed back from the table and stood. This seat will be empty when you get tired of sitting in it, he said, dropping coins on the table for his drink. Emma Rose nodded like he'd just confirmed something she already knew. I'll keep that in mind, she said. But when Garrett Stone walked out of Murphy's saloon that day, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Curiosity, just a flicker of it, like a spark trying to catch in wet kindling. But it was there. The next day, Emma Rose was at his table again. Same chair, same patient smile, same impossible calm in the face of his legendary coldness. You're persistent, Garrett observed, not sitting down. You're worth it, she replied, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. This time he didn't even bother with conversation, just turned and walked out, leaving her sitting alone at a table meant for two. But as he rode home to his lonely cabin, he found himself wondering what she would say if he asked her why. Why she kept coming back to sit with a man who clearly didn't want her there. Why she looked at him like she could see something everyone else had missed. He told himself he didn't care about the answers. But that night, for the first time in months, Garrett Stone found himself thinking about something other than the cold. By the third day, half the town was talking about the woman who had decided to make the Iceman's table her regular spot. They called her brave, called her foolish, called her crazy. Emma Rose called it Tuesday. You know what people are saying about you? Garrett asked when he found her there again, same as before. I imagine they're saying quite a lot, Emma Rose replied. People usually do when they don't understand something. And you think they don't understand what you're doing here? Emma Rose considered this, her head tilted slightly like she was listening to something only she could hear. I think they don't understand that sometimes the best things in life require patience, that some treasures are buried deep and you have to be willing to dig. Garrett Stone felt something crack inside his chest, just a hairline fracture in the ice he'd built around his heart. What makes you think there's treasure worth digging for? Emma Rose smiled, and for just a moment, the coldest cowboy in the territory felt the first hint of warmth he'd known in years. Because, she said simply, frozen things aren't dead things, they're just sleeping things, waiting for spring. And that's when Garrett Stone realized he was in more trouble than he'd ever imagined. Because Emma Rose wasn't just sitting at his table. She was settling in for the long winter, prepared to wait however long it took for his particular spring to come. The question was, would he let it? The fourth day came and went, and Emma Rose was there. The fifth day, too. By the end of the first week, Murphy had stopped asking if she wanted to order something and just brought her a cup of coffee when she arrived each morning at precisely 10 o'clock. Garrett Stone found himself checking his pocket watch more often than he cared to admit. Found himself taking the long way to town so he could ride past Murphy's window and see if that familiar blue dress was visible through the glass. He told himself it was coincidence, this new awareness of time, this sudden interest in the town's daily rhythms. But frozen hearts, like everything else in nature, respond to patterns. And Emma Rose was becoming a pattern in his life, whether he wanted her there or not. You're going to wear a hole in that chair, he said on the 8th day, finally sitting down across from her instead of standing like a man ready to bolt. "Chairs are made to be sat in," Emma Rose replied, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup like it was precious. "This one seems to fit me just fine." Garrett studied her face in the dim saloon light. She wasn't beautiful in the way Sarah had been, all golden hair and painted lips. Emma Rose was something quieter, something that grew on a man slow and steady. Her eyes were brown as creek stones, and when she looked at him, he felt like she was reading words written in a language only she understood. "Where did you come from?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Does it matter?" "Everything matters when you're sitting at a man's table every day for over a week." Emma Rose smiled, and there was something sad in it, something that recognized the weight of leaving places behind. "I came from somewhere that didn't want me," she said simply. "So I came here." "And what makes you think here wants you?" She looked around the saloon, at the weathered faces of men who had learned to expect disappointment from life, at the walls stained with smoke and decades of hard living. "I don't think here wants anybody in particular," she said, "but I think here needs people who are willing to stay anyway." Garrett felt that crack in his chest widen just a little more. "Staying's harder than leaving," he said. "I know." Emma Rose met his eyes directly. "That's why it matters more." They sat in silence after that. But it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the cold emptiness Garrett had wrapped around himself like armor, but something warmer, something that felt like the space between words where understanding lives. When he got up to leave that day, Garrett Stone did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He tipped his hat to a woman and said, "Same time tomorrow, then." Emma Rose's smile could have melted snow. "I'll be here," she said, and she was. The second week brought changes subtle as shifting seasons. Garrett still sat with his back to the wall, still kept his hat pulled low, but he started ordering 2 coffees instead of whiskey, started asking questions instead of just enduring Emma Rose's presence. "What did you do before you came here?" he asked on a Tuesday that felt warmer than the calendar suggested it should. "I taught school," Emma Rose said, stirring sugar into her coffee with slow, careful motions. "Little ones mostly, 6 to 10 years old." "Why'd you stop?" Something flickered across her face, quick as shadow over water. "Same reason you stopped doing whatever made you happy, I imagine. Life got in the way." Garrett leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You don't know anything about what made me happy." "Don't I?" Emma Rose tilted her head, and that look was back, the one that made him feel transparent as glass. "You've got calluses that say you work with horses. Your boots are worn on the outside edges, which means you spend more time in the saddle than on foot, and there's a tan line on your finger where a ring used to be." Garrett's hand moved involuntarily to cover the pale band of skin she'd noticed. "You see too much," he said. "I see what's there," Emma Rose replied. "The question is why you're trying so hard to hide it. Maybe because some things are better left buried. And maybe," she said gently, "some things are just waiting for the right person to help dig them up." That night, alone in his cabin with only the wind for company, Garrett Stone found himself thinking about Emma Rose's words, about buried things and patient hands and the difference between hiding and protecting. He thought about Sarah too, for the first time in months without the familiar stab of betrayal that usually accompanied her memory. Instead, he found himself wondering if he'd been carrying her ghost around not out of love, but out of habit. If the wall he'd built around his heart wasn't keeping love out so much as keeping fear in. The thought unsettled him more than Emma Rose's daily presence ever had. By the 3rd week, people in town had stopped staring when Garrett Stone walked into Murphy's and sat down across from the woman in the blue dress. They'd started nodding instead, like this new routine was as natural as sunrise, like maybe the Iceman was melting after all. "You're causing quite a stir," Garrett told Emma Rose on a Thursday morning when the snow had finally stopped falling long enough for the sun to remember what it was supposed to do. "Am I?" She looked genuinely surprised. I'm just sitting here. You've been just sitting here for 3 weeks. In a town this size, that's headline news. Emma Rose laughed, and the sound was like water over stones, easy and musical. What are they saying? That you're either the bravest woman in the territory or the most foolish. What do you think? Garrett considered this, really considered it. 3 weeks ago, he would have said foolish without hesitation. But 3 weeks of watching Emma Rose sit patient as stone, 3 weeks of conversation that felt like sunlight creeping through curtains, 3 weeks of someone choosing to stay in his vicinity without wanting anything from him in return, had changed something fundamental in his perspective. I think, he said slowly, that brave and foolish might be the same thing sometimes. Emma Rose's smile was soft as spring rain. Now you're starting to understand. Understand what? Why I'm here. Garrett felt his heart do something it hadn't done in years. It skipped just once, like a stone across still water. And why are you here, Emma Rose? She leaned forward slightly, her brown eyes serious as prayer. Because some things are worth waiting for, Garrett Stone, and some people are worth the risk of looking foolish. The way she said his name, like it was something precious instead of something to be endured, made that crack in his chest split wide open. For the first time in 3 years, Garrett Stone felt the dangerous warmth of hope creeping in. And for the first time since Sarah Mitchell had walked out of his life, he found himself wondering what it would feel like to let someone stay. The 4th week arrived with the kind of cold that made men question their sanity for living in Montana territory. The kind of cold that froze spit before it hit the ground and turned breath into clouds thick as campfire smoke. But inside Murphy's saloon, at a corner table that had become as familiar as home, something warmer than whiskey was brewing. Garrett Stone found himself arriving earlier each day, telling himself it was coincidence, even as he checked his pocket watch and quickened his pace when 10 o'clock approached. Emma Rose was always there first, somehow, like she materialized with the morning light, her blue dress a constant in a world that had taught him nothing lasted. You ever get cold sitting here all day? He asked, settling into what had become his chair without the usual hesitation. Emma Rose wrapped her fingers around her coffee cup, steam rising between them like prayers made visible. Cold's just weather, she said. It passes. Not in Montana, it doesn't. Here, cold's a way of life. She looked at him with those creek stone eyes, and he felt that familiar sensation of being read like scripture. Is it? Or is that just what people tell themselves when they're afraid of thawing out? Garrett felt his jaw tighten, the old defenses rising like hackles on a threatened dog. Some things freeze for good reason. Do they? Emma Rose's voice was gentle as spring rain on dry ground. Or do they freeze because it's easier than feeling? The words hit him like a physical blow, sharp and sudden and entirely too close to truth. He started to push back from the table, started to retreat into the familiar safety of his walls, but something in her expression stopped him cold. She wasn't judging him, wasn't trying to crack him open like a walnut for the meat inside. She was just sitting there, patient as stone, like she had all the time in the world for him to figure out his own heart. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. But the words came out rougher than he intended, like they'd been scraped against something raw. Maybe not, Emma Rose agreed. But I know what I see. And what do you see? She leaned back in her chair, studying him with the kind of attention most people reserved for things they were planning to buy or break. I see a man who's forgotten that hearts aren't meant to be frozen, that the cold he's carrying around isn't protection, it's prison. Garrett Stone had faced down armed men without flinching, had stared into the eyes of wolves and bears and things that went bump in the night. But Emma Rose's quiet certainty undid him in ways that violence never could. You think you can just sit here every day and wait for me to melt? The question came out harder than he meant it to, edged with the kind of desperation a man feels when his carefully constructed world starts shifting beneath his feet. Emma Rose smiled, and there was something infinitely patient in it, something that spoke of deep roots and longer seasons. I'm not trying to melt you, Garrett. I'm just trying to show you that you're worth the wait." The words settled between them like snow on still water, quiet and transformative, and impossible to take back. Garrett felt something fundamental shift in his chest, like ice cracking under the weight of spring. "Why?" The word came out barely above a whisper, rougher than gravel, carrying 3 years of confusion and hurt and carefully guarded hope. Emma Rose reached across the table, not to touch him, but to lay her hand flat on the scarred wood between them. Close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, far enough away that the choice to bridge that distance would be his. "Because," she said simply, "everyone deserves to be seen, really seen. Not just the armor they wear, or the walls they build, but the person underneath. The person they were before the world taught them to hide." Garrett stared at her hand, at the way her fingers rested steady and sure against the table's surface, at the calluses that spoke of work and worry, at the pale line where a ring had once rested, at the gentle strength that seemed to emanate from her very bones. "You're running from something too," he said. It wasn't a question. Emma Rose didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't try to deflect or deny. "Yes," she said simply, "we all are, one way or another." "What happened to you?" For the first time since she'd started sitting at his table, Emma Rose hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the careful consideration a person gives to wounds that are still tender to the touch. "I trusted the wrong person," she said finally. "Gave my heart to a man who saw it as something to be owned instead of treasured. When I finally found the courage to leave, he made sure everyone in town knew his version of the story." Garrett felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and sudden and protective. What did he tell them? Emma Rose's smile was sad as autumn, touched with the kind of grief that comes from losing not just love, but the ability to trust in it. That I was a woman of loose morals, that I had led him on, taken his money, broken promises I never made. Small towns have long memories for that kind of scandal. "So you left." "I ran," she corrected, "like a coward, like someone who believed his lies more than her own truth." Garrett leaned forward, drawn by something he couldn't name. "And now?" "Now I'm tired of running, tired of letting other people's words define who I am." She looked at him directly, unflinching. "Tired of letting fear make my choices for me." The silence that followed was different from any they'd shared before. Heavier, more honest, like the air before a storm, charged with the possibility of change. "The man who hurt you," Garrett said slowly, "is he why you understand about frozen hearts?" Emma Rose nodded. "Hearts freeze to protect themselves, but protection and prison aren't the same thing, even when they feel like it." Garrett Stone had spent 3 years believing that feeling nothing was better than feeling everything. That ice was safer than fire, that walls were stronger than bridges. But sitting across from Emma Rose, watching the way she carried her own pain with such quiet dignity, he began to wonder if he'd been wrong about more than just the weather. "What if the ice is too thick?" he asked. "What if it's been frozen so long it can't remember how to thaw?" Emma Rose's smile was warm as summer sunshine, bright as hope itself. "Then you start small," she said. "1 degree at a time, 1 day at a time, 1 choice at a time." "And if it hurts?" "Oh, it will hurt," she said with the certainty of someone who had lived through her own thawing. "Growing always hurts. But the alternative is staying frozen forever, and that's not living, Garrett. That's just surviving." Outside Murphy's saloon, the Montana wind howled like a thing possessed, rattling windows and reminding everyone within earshot that winter still held the territory in its grip. But inside, at a corner table where 2 wounded souls had found something worth fighting for, the first tentative warmth of spring was beginning to bloom. Garrett Stone reached across the table, slowly, carefully, like a man approaching a wild thing he didn't want to spook. His fingers found Emma Rose's hand, traced the line of her knuckles, marveled at the way her skin felt like sun-warmed stone beneath his touch. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice rough with honesty. I don't know how to be anything other than cold. Emma Rose turned her hand palm up, letting his fingers rest in the cradle of hers. You don't have to know, she said softly. You just have to be willing to try. And for the first time in 3 years, as he sat holding the hand of a woman who had chosen to wait for him like she belonged there, Garrett Stone felt the dangerous, terrifying, wonderful possibility of warmth creeping back into his life. The ice around his heart didn't melt all at once. Ice that thick, that old, that carefully maintained, doesn't give up without a fight. But it cracked, just a little, just enough to let in the light. And Emma Rose, patient as seasons, settled in for however long it took for spring to finally come to the coldest cowboy in the territory. Because some things, she knew, were worth the wait. The 5th week brought with it a kind of reckoning that neither Garrett nor Emma Rose had anticipated. Word travels fast in small towns, faster still when it carries the weight of scandal, and by the time the snow began to thin on the ground, whispers had begun to thicken in the air. It started with sideways glances and hushed conversations that died the moment Garrett walked into Murphy's. Then came the pointed questions from men who had never cared about his business before, suddenly interested in his daily routine, his newfound sociability, his apparent thawing toward the mysterious woman in blue. Heard you've been keeping regular company, said Tom Bradley, the town's self-appointed keeper of moral standards, cornering Garrett near the general store one afternoon. Folks are wondering about your intentions. Garrett felt the old coldness creep back up his spine, familiar as an unwelcome friend. Folks should mind their own business, he replied, his voice carrying the edge that had once made grown men step aside. But Tom Bradley was the kind of man who mistook nosiness for righteousness, and he pressed on like a dog with a bone. Woman like that, showing up from nowhere, making herself comfortable with a man of your standing. People talk, Stone. They wonder what kind of arrangement you might have. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a green fire, acrid and poisonous. Garrett felt his hands curl into fists, felt the ice in his veins turn sharp enough to cut. But before he could respond, before he could let the old fury loose, he thought of Emma Rose, of the way she described her own flight from scandal, the way other people's words had chased her across state lines like wolves. Let them wonder, he said quietly, but with a finality that made Tom Bradley take a step back. And let them know that any man who spreads lies about that woman will answer to me, personally. The warning was delivered in the same tone Garrett might use to discuss the weather, but there was steel beneath the calm that made Bradley's face go pale. The man mumbled something about Christian concern and scurried away like a rabbit who just remembered what hawks were for. But the damage was done. By evening, the whispers had grown teeth. Emma Rose was waiting at their table when Garrett arrived the next morning, same as always. But something in her posture spoke of storms weathered in the dark hours before dawn. Her coffee sat untouched, gone cold, and her hands rested flat on the table like she was bracing herself against rough seas. "You've heard," she said without looking up when he settled into his chair. "Some of it." Garrett studied her face, noting the careful way she held herself, the deliberate steadiness of her breathing. "How much of it's true?" Emma Rose's laugh was sharp as broken glass, bitter as winter wind. "Does it matter? Truth and gossip rarely keep the same company in places like this. It matters to me." She looked up then, and he saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of weary resignation that spoke of battles fought and lost before. "They're saying I'm a fallen woman," she said simply. "That I came here looking for a man to keep me, that you and I have been conducting ourselves improperly." She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the table's scarred surface. "They're saying I'm no better than a common whore, and you're fool enough to be taken in by my wiles." Garrett felt rage kindle in his chest, hot and sudden as lightning strike. "Who's saying this?" "Does it matter who? It's being said. That's enough." "The hell it is." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that had once made his reputation. "Names, Emma Rose. I want names. But she was already shaking her head, already pulling back into herself like a flower closing against frost. Don't you see? This is exactly what they want. They want you to ride out in defense of my honor, to make a scene, to prove their point about impropriety and scandal and women who don't know their place. So what do you suggest? That we let them talk? That we pretend their words don't matter? Emma Rose was quiet for a long moment, staring at her cold coffee like it might hold answers she desperately needed. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I suggest I stop coming here. The words hit Garrett like a physical blow, sharp and unexpected, and entirely too familiar. He'd heard them before, in different forms, from different lips. The sound of someone choosing the easier path, the safer road, the exit that led away from him and everything he might offer. Running again? The question came out harsher than he intended, edged with 3 years of accumulated hurt. Emma Rose's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with sudden fire. Don't you dare! Don't you dare compare me to whatever ghost you've been carrying around. I sat at this table for a month, Garrett Stone. I waited while you decided whether I was worth the risk of feeling something. I stayed when any sensible woman would have walked away. Then why leave now? Because staying will ruin you. The words came out raw, honest, scraped from some deep place where truth lived alongside pain. These people, they'll forgive a man for being cold. They'll forgive him for being distant, for keeping to himself, for choosing solitude over society. But they won't forgive him for choosing me. Garrett stared at her across the small space between them, seeing clearly for the first time the weight she'd been carrying, the careful way she'd positioned herself in his life, close enough to matter but far enough away to protect him from exactly this kind of judgment. You think I care what they say? I think you should care. You have to live here, work here, build whatever life you're going to build in this place. I'm just passing through. Are you? The question surprised them both. Passing through? Emma Rose hesitated, and in that hesitation, Garrett saw the truth she'd been hiding from herself as much as from him. She'd been running when she came to Bear Creek Township, true enough, but somewhere in the course of 4 weeks and countless cups of coffee and the slow, patient work of melting a frozen heart, she'd stopped running and started hoping. I don't know, she admitted finally. I don't know anything anymore except that I won't be the reason you become a pariah in your own town. Garrett pushed back from the table, stood slowly, his mind working through possibilities like a man planning strategy for war. Because that's what this was, in its way. A battle for the right to choose who mattered, who got to have a voice in his life, who got to decide what kind of man he was going to be. Emma Rose, he said quietly, do you remember what you told me about frozen things? She looked up at him, confusion flickering across her features. That they're not dead things, they're sleeping things. And what did you say about growing? That it always hurts. Garrett nodded, reaching for his hat. Then it's time for this town to do some growing, and if it hurts, well, that just means it's working. Before she could protest, before she could argue or try to talk him out of whatever plan was forming behind his eyes, he was gone. Walking out of Murphy's saloon with the kind of purpose that made other men step aside and wonder what storm was coming. Emma Rose sat alone at their table, watching through the window as Garrett Stone mounted his horse and rode toward the center of town with the bearing of a man who had finally remembered what he was fighting for. And for the first time since the whispers had started, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth the scandal. What Garrett Stone did next would be talked about in Bear Creek Township for years to come. Not whispered about in dark corners or muttered behind hands, but spoken of openly, with the kind of respect reserved for moments when a man shows exactly who he is beneath all the armor and ice and careful distance. He rode straight to the church, not because he was particularly religious, though he'd been raised to respect the Lord's house, but because Sunday service was still 2 hours away and he knew every gossip and busybody in town would be gathering on the steps, eager to share the latest scandal before settling in to hear about salvation. They were there, just as he'd expected. A cluster of women in their best dresses and men in their Sunday coats, voices rising and falling in the particular rhythm of people who had found something delicious to discuss. The conversation died the moment Garrett's boots hit the church steps, silence spreading outward like ripples in a pond. "Folks," he said, touching the brim of his hat with a kind of courtesy that was somehow more threatening than outright hostility. "Garrett," replied Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife and undisputed queen of the town's social hierarchy. "We were just discussing the importance of proper Christian behavior." "Were you now?" His voice was mild, conversational, the tone of a man commenting on the weather. "That's interesting, because I was just thinking about the same thing." The group shifted uncomfortably, sensing something in his manner that made them suddenly aware of how they must look, huddled together like vultures over fresh carrion. "You see," Garrett continued, "I've been reading my Bible lately. Amazing what you find in there when you actually pay attention. Take Matthew chapter 7. Judge not, that ye be not judged." Strong words from a man who knew something about forgiveness. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed pink as her Sunday dress. "Mr. Stone, if you're referring to the concerns about your association with that woman—" "That woman," Garrett interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying the edge of winter wind, "has a name, Emma Rose, and she's been nothing but respectful to every person in this town, including those who seem determined to think the worst of her." "But surely you must see how it looks," stammered Tom Bradley, emboldened by the crowd at his back. "A single woman, appearing from nowhere, making herself comfortable with a bachelor. The implications," Garrett said, stepping closer until Tom had to crane his neck to meet his eyes, "are in your mind, not in our actions. Miss Emma Rose sits at a table in a public establishment and drinks coffee. We talk. We behave with perfect propriety. If you see something improper in that, the fault lies with your vision, not with our conduct." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. These people had known Garrett Stone as the Iceman, the hermit, the cold and distant figure who wanted nothing to do with their society. They were unprepared for this version of him, articulate and angry and entirely unintimidated by their collective judgment. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice rising just enough to carry to every ear on the church steps, "I want to make something perfectly clear. Emma Rose is under my protection. Any person who spreads lies about her character will answer to me. Any person who treats her with disrespect will answer to me. And any person who thinks they have the right to dictate how I spend my time or with whom I spend it will discover exactly how wrong they are." He paused, letting his gaze move from face to face, making sure each person understood that this wasn't a general threat, but a personal promise. "Now," he said, settling his hat more firmly on his head, "I believe you have a service to attend. Might I suggest paying particular attention to the sermon on love and acceptance? I have a feeling you could use the instruction." With that, Garrett Stone turned and walked back to his horse, leaving behind a crowd of people who suddenly found themselves examining their own souls in ways they hadn't expected when they'd gathered to tear apart someone else's reputation. But he wasn't finished. Not by a long shot.